If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
The forest was unnaturally quiet on the night before the offensive, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Sergeant Markov stood beside the hulking silhouette of his T-34, its steel plates still warm from the long day's march. The sky above glowed faintly red from distant artillery, while thin smoke drifted through the dark pines, carrying the metallic bite of cordite. His crew moved silently around the tank, each man lost in his own thoughts, yet bound by the same unspoken tension. Tomorrow, before sunrise, their brigade was expected to break through the German defensive line, a line reinforced by newly arrived armor that intelligence claimed included Panthers and possibly a Tiger detachment. Markov had heard enough stories about those machines to know the cost of underestimating them. But he also knew that his crew relied on him, and that hesitation, even for a moment, could doom them all. As he checked the main gun one last time, his hands steady despite the cold, Markov replayed every instruction, every contingency, and every maneuver in his mind. The coming hours would test not only their skill, but their ability to trust each other when visibility vanished in smoke and chaos.
Inside the tank, the dim red lamps cast long shadows across the cramped steel interior. The crew settled into their positions with the familiarity of men who had spent months surviving in this metal shell, eating, sleeping, fighting, and burying their dead. Driver Petrov whispered a crude joke to break the tension, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying the fear they all carried. Loader Semyon polished the spent cartridge stains from the turret floor, a ritual he repeated before every battle, as if erasing yesterday's violence could somehow prepare him for tomorrow's. The radio crackled with fragmented reports: German armor massing near the river bend, enemy reconnaissance planes spotted at dusk, infantry reserves arriving late. None of it changed the reality. They were going in at dawn whether the odds favored them or not. Through the open hatch, Markov could hear the distant rumble of tank engines from the adjacent companies, each machine a reminder of the scale of the battle forming in the darkness. He knew that by this time tomorrow, many of these engines would be silent, their crews gone. Yet, as he climbed into the commander's seat and closed the hatch overhead, sealing them into the tight iron cocoon, he felt the familiar shift inside himself, fear tightening into focus, doubt hardening into resolve. The storm was coming, and they would meet it head-on.
The order came shortly before dawn. The German armored group had pushed deeper than expected, threatening to cut off the supply arteries feeding the Soviet advance. The Fremont depots, a sprawling maze of fuel drums, ammunition crates, and repair yards, were now within range of enemy spearheads. If they fell, the entire front could collapse within hours. Sergeant Markov's T-34 was among the few tanks positioned close enough to intervene, and the brigade command issued a blunt directive: reach the depots first, or lose everything. The crew felt the urgency as the engine roared to life, the tank surging forward across muddy fields, still slick with night frost. Markov stood half-exposed in the open hatch, scanning the horizon where thin columns of smoke already signaled the first clashes. German armored cars had been sighted near the rail line, probing for weak points, and rapid-fire bursts from their cannons echoed across the valley. Every second the T-34 gained mattered. The depots were not just storage, they were the lifeline of the offensive, the heart pumping fuel and ammunition into hundreds of machines preparing for battle. And now the enemy was lunging for that heart.
As they closed the distance, the terrain shifted into a cluttered industrial sprawl, half-buried tracks, abandoned freight wagons, and rows of warehouses casting long shadows in the pale morning light. The tank jolted violently as Petrov pushed the engine to its limits, weaving between debris while Markov mapped a path in real time. He could already hear the distant churn of German engines, a low, mechanical growl that meant the enemy vanguard was closing in fast. Inside the turret, the crew switched from tense anticipation into calculated readiness. Gunner McHale adjusted the sighting system, mentally rehearsing the first shot he might get, maybe against an armored car, maybe something heavier. Loader Semyon braced himself, hands hovering near the shell racks. They were racing not just against the Germans, but against the clock. If the fuel stores ignited, the entire depot would become an inferno. If the ammunition warehouses were compromised, the Soviet advance could be crippled before it began. As the T-34 barreled into the perimeter, the first tracer round sliced past the hull, confirming what Markov already knew. They had arrived just in time, but so had the enemy.
The road to Umbel was never meant for war. It was a narrow, twisting village route, lined with sodden fields, shallow drainage ditches, and stone farmhouses half-collapsed from weeks of shelling. But in the chaos of the German breakthrough, it became the only artery through which Markov's tank and the entire Soviet response force behind him could reach the front. As the T-34 rolled onto the uneven path, the crew instantly felt the danger. The track was bordered by terrain perfect for an ambush, low ground that allowed enemy recon units to hide, clusters of trees scarred by recent firefights, and countless wrecks of Soviet and German vehicles alike. Burned-out half-tracks smoldered beside shattered carts, their wheels still turning in the cold morning wind. This wasn't a road anymore. It was a graveyard of every unit that had tried to force its way through ahead of them. Markov gripped the hatch rim, scanning every ridge and shadow. He could sense the crew holding their breath as they passed the first destroyed tank. A KV-1 with the turret blown off, still steaming from an internal detonation. The message was clear. The enemy was close. Too close.
Halfway through the pass, the silence broke. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from the tree line, stitching the mud beside the moving tank. Petrov swerved instinctively, the T-34's suspension shrieking as it hit a ditch and climbed out again. Mikhail swung the turret with a practiced precision of a veteran, firing a high-explosive round into the source of the muzzle flashes. The explosion lit the roadside in a red-orange bloom, sending debris into the morning haze, but more fire followed from the opposite side. A German anti-tank team had set up a perfect kill zone, and now they were scrambling to get a clean shot. A Panzerfaust whooshed past the hull, exploding against a ruined barn. Semyon shouted ranges and reloaded like a machine, keeping the gun primed as incoming rounds hammered the armor. The tank forced forward, grinding over fencing and debris, each meter feeling like a battle of its own. By the time they burst out of the narrow defile and into open terrain, the crew was drenched in sweat and smoke. Behind them, the Ambul's road glowed with fires and drifting ash, a corridor of death they had survived by seconds. But ahead lay something worse. The German armor they had been racing to intercept. The open field beyond the Amble's road stretched wide and deceptively calm, but Markov knew better than to trust the quiet. This sector was where the reconnaissance reports had repeatedly mentioned German armor, fast, coordinated, and far more numerous than Soviet command had anticipated. As the T-34 climbed onto a low ridge, Mikhail spotted it first, a flash of movement on the far tree line, followed by the unmistakable silhouette of a Panzer Kampfwagen 5, then another, then a third. 3 Panthers advancing in a staggered formation, their gun barrels level and steady, their engines growling like predators closing in on prey. Markov's pulse spiked. He knew the math. 3 Panthers frontally meant death. Their long-barreled 75mm guns could punch through a T-34 before his crew even finished aiming. For a heartbeat, he considered falling back, regrouping with the trailing Soviet units. But that would mean surrendering the ridge, and the Germans would then have a direct path toward the depots they were trying to protect. "Hold position," Markov ordered, the words steady despite the tightening in his chest. The crew locked in. Petrov braced the hull, Semyon readied the next shell, and Mikhail adjusted the sights with a calmness that only came from years of fighting steel with steel. If they were going to die, it would not be while running.
The Panthers struck first. A brilliant flash erupted from the lead tank, followed a second later by the terrifying crack of armor-piercing steel tearing through the air. The round slammed into the ridge just meters below the T-34, showering the tank in soil and rock fragments. Petrov reversed a half-meter to adjust their angle of defilade, while Mikhail fired back, his shell soaring in a downward arc and detonating against the Panther's frontal armor, leaving nothing but scorch marks. "No penetration," Semyon shouted, already loading another round. The German tanks spread out, attempting to flank. Markov felt the cold weight of understanding. They were moments away from being bracketed and destroyed. But then he noticed something. A small dip in the terrain to their right, a shallow depression that could hide them for seconds at a time. Seconds they desperately needed. "Hard right, into the low ground!" The T-34 lurched downward just as another German shell ripped past their turret, missing by inches. Hidden for a brief, precious moment, Mikhail fired again, this time at the side plate of the second Panther. The explosion was sharper, louder. Flames burst from the enemy tank's engine deck as it halted abruptly, smoke pouring from its vents. 2 Panthers remained, and now they were angry. But Markov felt something shift. For the first time in the battle, they had struck back and survived.
The darkness settled over Stumont like a suffocating blanket, pierced only by the occasional flare and the fiery glow of burning vehicles. After the initial encounter on Ardennes Road, the battered Shermans had pulled back to regroup, but rest was impossible. The cold seeped into metal and bone alike, freezing fingers to gun barrels, turning ammunition cold and brittle. Miller crouched inside his Sherman, the hiss of steam from the engine mingling with the distant crack of gunfire. Outside, the valley echoed with the relentless rhythm of conflict, shells detonating in bursts, artillery thundering from distant positions, the staccato chatter of MG-42s, and the muffled screams of men caught in the inferno. Every time a German patrol attempted to push forward, the daredevils responded with disciplined fire, each shot calculated, each movement choreographed. Miller could feel the tank shudder with each round fired. It was barely operational, yet somehow it held together, just enough to keep the SS advance at bay. The once pristine Shermans of Fremont Depot now bore the scars of 100 repairs, missing hatches, dented hulls, and patched armor, but they were alive, and their crews were determined.
As the night deepened, the Germans tried everything: flanking maneuvers through the tree line, sniper teams crawling toward firing positions, and armored probes meant to test the defenders' resolve. But the Americans had adapted quickly. The 740th's mechanics worked feverishly under the cover of darkness, replacing broken tracks and patching breached hulls by flashlight, while artillery observers directed shells into every suspected enemy position. From his hatch, Miller could see tracer fire streak across the fog, illuminating the battlefield in stark orange lines. Flashes from explosions briefly lit the surrounding cliffs, revealing twisted metal and debris scattered across the frozen terrain. Inside the Sherman, Miller's hands moved almost mechanically. Load, ram, secure, fire, over and over, until it became a rhythm, a dance with survival. By dawn, 3 more enemy tanks had been destroyed. Infantry losses had slowed the SS advance, and the Americans still held Stumont. Exhausted but alive, the men realized that their defiance during these nights of fire had bought critical time for reinforcements, proving that courage, improvisation, and grit could turn even hastily repaired scrap into an instrument of resistance.
Morning broke over Stumont with a pale, icy light that barely cut through the lingering fog. The previous night's victories were now tempered by a sobering reality. The advance towards Stumont village would not be easy. As First Lieutenant John Calloway led his platoon down the narrow Aumble Road, the Americans encountered the Germans' cruel ingenuity, a freshly laid minefield spanning the width of the valley path. The first Sherman struck with a violent jolt, sending 12 track links flying into the frozen air. Metal screeched against metal, and the vehicle lurched sideways, wedging itself across the road. The second Sherman followed moments later, triggering a second mine that tore through the right track. Engines screamed in futile protest as the tanks ground to a halt. Enemy MG-42s and automatic weapons opened up from concealed positions, the valley walls echoing the relentless staccato of gunfire. Miller, trapped inside his Sherman, could feel every vibration, every tremor, as he and his crew scrambled to escape through the hatches into the bitter wind. Snow mixed with sleet stung exposed skin, and each man fought to reach the nearest ditch or tree line. The carefully measured momentum gained during the previous day's assault was abruptly lost. For a brief, terrifying moment, the American column was immobilized, vulnerable, and under the constant threat of annihilation.
Behind the wrecked Shermans, the battalion worked feverishly to regain control. Mechanics crawled under tanks, replacing broken tracks and jury-rigging hydraulic lines with whatever parts could be salvaged. Artillery observers relayed coordinates for covering fire, attempting to suppress the German positions, while engineers painstakingly cleared a path through the minefield. Miller, cold and exhausted, continued loading shells, each high-explosive round a lifeline against the advancing SS infantry. House-to-house fighting erupted in nearby hamlets, the roar of small arms punctuated by artillery explosions. Despite the chaos, the 740th Tank Battalion refused to retreat. Every inch of ground gained was bought with ingenuity and resolve. By noon, American forces had secured the hamlet of Targen, establishing a fragile foothold. Yet the price was evident. Tanks lay immobilized.
infantrymen were weary, and the valley was littered with twisted metal and the remnants of the fierce struggle. The night had not yet ended, and the lost progress reminded everyone that in war, every advance could be contested, every gain temporary, and every victory came at the edge of exhaustion and survival.
By late afternoon, American forces had reached the eastern outskirts of Stumont, but the centerpiece of German resistance loomed above them, St. Edward's Sanatorium, a massive brick fortress perched on a steep hill, commanding the surrounding terrain with unyielding authority. Every window, every doorway, every section of the three-story building was a potential killing zone. Staff Sergeant Homer Thompson's Sherman and Miller's own tank provided covering fire behind stone barns, hurling high explosive shells into suspected positions while infantry cautiously advanced through the snow-laden streets. SS Panzer Grenadiers inside the sanatorium responded with brutal efficiency. Grenades, machine guns, and small arms fire turned each approach into a deadly gauntlet. By 2300 hours, the Germans had reinforced their positions with whatever they could salvage, and a counterattack surged up the hill in waves, screaming and firing, determined to reclaim the high ground. Despite their courage, American defenders were pushed back under the weight of sheer numbers. By midnight, the sanatorium remained in enemy hands, the road blocked with destroyed Shermans, and Piper's forces seemed poised to break the fragile American line entirely. Miller's tank sat helplessly at the base of the cliff, the gun unable to elevate high enough to engage targets inside the building, leaving him to listen to the cacophony above, screams, gunfire, and explosions, all while the temperature inside the turret plummeted and frost formed on every metal surface.
In the early hours of December 21st, ingenuity became the only path forward. Captain James Barry, refusing to accept stalemate, scouted a hidden approach around the sanatorium, identifying a steep cliff face where a makeshift corduroy road could be constructed. Using felled trees, shell casings, and the help of infantry engineers, the team created a precarious track allowing Shermans to move within striking distance of the building's walls. By dawn, a platoon of tanks rolled forward along this improvised path, firing point-blank into windows and doorways, driving the SS defenders into disarray. The roar of 105mm and 75mm shells, the staccato of machine guns, and the determined advance of American infantry converged in a symphony of destruction. Soldiers stormed the entrance while tanks suppressed the upper floors, forcing the Germans to retreat room by room. By noon, St. Edward's Sanatorium was recaptured. Nearly 250 civilians, trapped for 3 days, emerged from the basement, dazed but alive. Elsewhere, Miller and his comrades continued to hunt remaining German armor, destroying a Panther and a captured American Sherman, breaking Piper's outer defenses. The brutal and calculated assault illustrated the combination of courage, improvisation, and relentless pressure that defined the 740th Tank Battalion, turning what seemed an impossible position into a hard-won victory, while setting the stage for the final collapse of German resistance in the valley.
By the morning of December 23rd, the situation for SS Gruppenführer Otto Piper had deteriorated catastrophically. From commanding 5,800 men and 58 tanks just a week earlier, he now faced a shrinking perimeter of roughly 800 exhausted troops and 28 operational tanks, trapped in the ruins of Les Glaises. American forces surrounded him on three sides. The 119th Infantry blocked the western approaches, the 3rd Armored Division pressed from the north, and paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne held positions across the Amblay River to the south. Continuous artillery bombardments, over 57,000 shells fired in 4 days by the 30th Infantry Division alone, reduced buildings to rubble, set fires that turned streets into infernos, and shattered German morale. Every attempt to resupply was blocked, every defensive line worn thin. Piper's elite troops, once the spearhead of the Ardennes offensive, were now huddled in a contracting pocket, facing relentless bombardment and infantry assaults, while their fuel and ammunition dwindled to nothing. Desperation set in as American assault guns and Shermans methodically picked apart remaining German positions, the sound of high-explosive shells and machine gun fire echoing through the shattered village.
By late night, with no hope of relief or resupply, Piper made the only decision left: abandon all vehicles and equipment and attempt to escape on foot through American lines. The order stunned his soldiers. Hardened veterans who had crushed American divisions and burned villages, now facing retreat like common infantry. Over the next hours, what remained of Kampfgruppe Piper slipped eastward under the cover of darkness, leaving behind 28 heavy tanks, 70 half-tracks, countless artillery pieces, and thousands of dead, wounded, or captured. By dawn on December 24th, the SS presence in Les Glaises had effectively ceased. American forces consolidated their gains, securing Stumont and surrounding villages, while the remnants of Piper's once formidable unit vanished into the forest, decimated and broken. The 740th Tank Battalion, along with infantry allies, had stopped the farthest German advance of the Battle of the Bulge, turning what could have been a strategic disaster into a decisive defensive triumph. The combination of improvisation, industrial might, and sheer determination had transformed a handful of hastily repaired tanks into instruments capable of halting one of Nazi Germany's most feared armored formations, cementing the battalion's place in history.
Following the destruction of Piper's advance, the 740th Tank Battalion did not pause for celebration. The daredevils were immediately thrust into continuous operations across the European theater, supporting a series of offensives with the 82nd Airborne, the 8th, 63rd, and 86th Infantry Divisions. From December 24, 1944, through May 7, 1945, the battalion endured 120 days of relentless combat, moving from one frozen battlefield to the next. The soldiers adapted to sleeping in Shermans, often in the loader's position, while artillery shells cracked overhead and snow fell relentlessly outside. Ammunition froze, engines seized, and temperatures dropped far below zero, yet the crews maintained an extraordinary rhythm of loading, firing, repairing, and advancing. Miller, now part of the assault gun platoon, learned to handle 105mm shells with precision and speed, providing critical fire support for infantry and turning each vehicle into a mobile fortress. Every village, every farm, every road became a test of endurance and ingenuity as the battalion pushed through Ardennes, Rhineland, and Central Europe, confronting both German armor and entrenched infantry, while securing bridges, towns, and supply lines for advancing Allied forces.
By late April 1945, the battalion had crossed major rivers, including the Rhine and the Elbe, often using precarious pontoon bridges that tested both nerves and mechanical skill. Miller and his comrades witnessed the collapse of the Wehrmacht firsthand. Isolated pockets of German resistance were systematically eliminated, enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, and villages liberated one by one. The toll was brutal. Dozens of villages burned, thousands of enemy soldiers captured or killed, but the daredevils survived with remarkable resilience. By May 7th, the battalion reached the Baltic coast, having fought without respite for over 4 months. In total, the 740th had lost 43 men and 57 tanks, but had destroyed 69 enemy tanks, including 17 Tigers and King Tigers, and hundreds of vehicles and aircraft. Through endurance, improvisation, and relentless offensive action, the daredevils exemplified the mechanical, logistical, and human advantage that allowed American forces to dominate in Europe. For Private First Class Harry Miller, those 120 days transformed fear into professional instinct, shaping a soldier who had become part of a unit that changed the course of the final months of the war in Europe. When the guns fell silent on May 7, 1945, the 740th Tank Battalion had survived one of the most intense stretches of combat in the European theater. The soldiers emerged from 120 days of continuous fighting, exhausted, battle-hardened, and forever changed. Harry Miller, along with his comrades, returned to a world that had moved on while they were living in the metal confines of Shermans, assault guns, and frozen foxholes. For many, the war's intensity could not be matched in civilian life. The battalion remained in Germany on occupation duty through 1946, overseeing devastated towns, destroyed infrastructure, and the fragile rebuilding of communities. Veterans carried the memories of destroyed villages, comrades lost in action, and enemy units annihilated at Stumont and beyond. Yet for Miller, the war also brought a profound sense of purpose and accomplishment. He had witnessed firsthand how determination, improvisation, and courage could turn improvised scrapyard Shermans into decisive instruments of victory, stopping elite German units and saving countless lives. The battalion's legacy, though largely forgotten in mainstream histories, was preserved in memorials at Beaumotus, Arizona, and Neuchâtel, Belgium, and in the personal recollections of those who had survived the inferno of the Ardennes, Rhineland, and Central Europe campaigns. Miller transitioned from combat to civilian life with the same meticulous discipline he had learned in the tank. He served in the Air Force during Korea and Vietnam, rising to Senior Master Sergeant before retiring in 1966. Following military service, he worked in security, safety inspection, and eventually embraced music, taking up jazz and swing drumming in his later years. Like many veterans, Miller rarely spoke of the war, though he maintained a quiet pride in the feats of the 740th Tank Battalion. The stories of Stumont Station, the hastily repaired Fremont Depot Shermans, and the relentless push across Germany became personal memories,
later shared in interviews and memorial dedications. By the time of his passing in 2017, at age 89, Miller had lived a full life, shaped by the discipline, courage, and endurance forged in battle. The battalion's story remains a testament to the quiet heroism of ordinary soldiers whose improvisation and perseverance turned the tide in critical moments, proving that history is not only made in famous last stands, but also in the resolve of those who face overwhelming odds and do their duty without expectation of fame or reward.